He said it without looking up. That was what Thomas Webb would carry for years. Not the crowd that gathered later, not what came after. Just the way the man never once looked at his face. Derek Harmon picked up the guitar, turned it over, plucked one string the way you test if something is hollow, and said without raising his eyes, "Whoever built this didn't know what they were doing." Thomas said quietly, "My grandfather made it. By hand. 3 years." Derek pressed his thumb against the hand-carved bridge, studied the grain the way a man reads a receipt he suspects is wrong, set the guitar back on the blanket, and looked at the price tag, 40 pounds, and made a flat sound through his nose. Handmade by an amateur means imperfect. Imperfect means worthless at auction. 20 pounds. I am being generous. Thomas found the edge of the table. His knuckles went white. For a moment, no one moved. Then, a man 30 feet away slowly stopped walking. It was a cold Saturday morning at Portobello Road Market, London, September 2003. He had been at a record stall, his fingers resting on a sleeve he hadn't been reading, because something had reached him through the noise of the market. Not Derek's words, not Thomas's voice. One plucked string on a handmade guitar, reaching him the way a voice crosses a room when it belongs to someone you once knew and never went back to thank. He turned. The look on his face was not curiosity, it was recognition. The kind that arrives when something you believed was gone from the world turns out to still be in it. Nobody saw what moved across his lips in that moment. Nobody knew yet what that man and that guitar had shared on a night 40 years earlier, a night that had never fully let either of them go. If you have ever held something left behind by someone you loved, stay with this story. What happened next at that table will stay with you long after this video ends. Subscribe now so you never miss a story like this. This moment did not begin at Portobello Road. It began in a 12-foot workshop behind a terraced house in Shepherd's Bush 50 years earlier, with sawdust, linseed oil, and a man who believed every piece of wood had a voice waiting to be freed. Arthur Webb was born in 1922. No formal training, no famous teacher. What he had was a father who worked timber, hands that understood grain before his mind could explain why, and a patience that looked from the outside like stillness. By 1955, working musicians across London knew his name, not because Arthur sought anyone out, because word travels when something is made right. He built one guitar at a time, each taking months. Every morning he tapped the spruce top with 2 fingers, the way a doctor taps a chest, waiting for the wood to tell him it was ready. He never played a stage, never recorded, but he built instruments that carried other men's music into rooms and held it there long after the last note faded. Thomas spent every Saturday of his childhood in that workshop. He could not have been older than 5 the first time Arthur let him hold a finished guitar. Both of them on the low bench, the body warm from the lamp. Arthur never said much while he worked, but he hummed, a quiet, wandering melody, shapeless and unhurried. Thomas never knew what it was. He only knew that when he heard it, his grandfather was at peace. Arthur died 8 months ago at 81. He left Thomas one thing, the last guitar he ever built. Arthritis had been claiming his hands for 2 years before he finished it. 3 years in failing hands. Inside the sound hole, in soft pencil, handwriting gone unsteady near the end, "For Tom." Thomas had not meant to sell it. Then the eviction notice arrived for his mother's flat in Hammersmith. Then the second one. He wrote 40 pounds on a tag, tied it to the tuning peg, and drove to Portobello Road before the part of him that knew better could stop him. He had been standing behind that table for 2 hours when Derek Harmon arrived, and without Thomas noticing, someone else had arrived too. Someone who would have walked straight past on any other morning, if not for one plucked string on a handmade guitar stopping him cold. Derek came back. This time he had someone with him. The colleague was louder, younger, padded jacket, a clipboard he never seemed to write on. He picked up the guitar without asking, strummed all 6 strings with the flat of his thumb, the sound a guitar makes when someone wants to know if it works, not how it sounds, and handed it back with a look that said everything before Derek spoke. Derek pointed to the grain on the spruce top, irregular near the bass side. He pointed to the hand-carved bridge, to his colleague, as though Thomas were not standing right there. You see this every weekend. Someone's grandfather built it in a shed, and the family thinks it is worth something. Sentiment is not value. The market does not care who made it. His colleague laughed, flat and short. Thomas looked at the guitar and thought about a Tuesday morning 2 winters ago. Arthritis had already taken most of Arthur's right hand by then. Thomas had come to drop off groceries and found him at the bench with the unfinished guitar body in his lap, not working, just holding it. Arthur had not heard him come in. He sat in the gray morning light, both palms flat against the wood, eyes closed. Thomas stood in the doorway, left the groceries on the step, and drove home. He never told Arthur he had been there. Some things are not meant to be interrupted. 20 pounds, Derek said. Final. Not for 20, Thomas said. Derek studied him the way he had studied the brain, briefly, without warmth. Then you bring it back when the pressure is worse, and take 15. He set the guitar down and checked his watch. 2 stalls away, the man in the dark cap had gone completely still. Hands in his pockets, back half-turned, facing a tray of old compasses he had no interest in. Head angled just enough. 4 minutes of that focused stillness, the kind that belongs to someone trying to confirm something they cannot yet allow themselves to believe. Thomas did not see him. He was watching Derek begin to turn away and feeling the weight of what that meant. Without this 40 pounds, a third notice would arrive before the month was out. Then from just behind Derek's shoulder, a quiet voice said, "I wonder, would you mind if I had a look at that?" Derek stopped, not because the voice was loud, but because something in it was not quite asking. It carried the tone of a man who already knew what that guitar was, and was giving Derek one last chance to step aside, on his own terms. If you have stayed this far, you already know this is not really a story about a guitar. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe so you never miss a moment like this one. The man removed his cap, one hand, tucked it into his jacket pocket. Then he looked at Thomas and waited. Derek had not fully turned yet. When he did, understanding took 3 seconds to arrive. He went very still. His colleague said nothing. At the next stall, a vendor who had worked this road since 1974 looked up from a box of silverware and did not look away again. Paul McCartney did not announce himself. He simply held out his hand toward the guitar and said it again, quieter. "May I?" Thomas nodded. He only knew that the man before him carried the calm of someone arriving somewhere they had always known they would one day arrive. Paul picked up the guitar. Not the way Derek had, not pricing, not assessing. The way you lift something carried in memory for 40 years. He held it by the waist, tilted the body toward the gray autumn light, ran his thumb down the neck. Then he angled the body and looked inside the sound hole. A small change moved across his face. Private. The kind that happens when something you did not know you were still carrying finally makes itself known. He looked at Thomas. "Your grandfather, what was his name?" "Arthur," Thomas said. "Arthur Webb." 3 seconds. Paul sat down on the edge of the table. Nobody told him he could not. Derek took 1 step back without deciding to, and Paul McCartney began to play. Not a Beatles song. Nothing the gathering crowd recognized. A slow, wandering melody, barely structured, moving the way a question moves when it has circled inside someone for decades. The guitar sounded different under his hands. The same instrument that had rung hollow under the colleague's strum, now opened like a room locked for years, waiting for the right key. Thomas watched, and something happened that he could not name. The melody was familiar, not famous familiar. It was the melody his grandfather hummed every Saturday morning in the workshop while the kettle boiled. Thomas had heard it 10,000 times and always believed it belonged to no one, something Arthur carried privately, going nowhere. It had been here all along, inside this guitar, waiting. Thomas's eyes filled. Paul let the last note fall quiet. Then he looked at Thomas. "I knew Arthur Webb," he said. "September 1962. The night before our first EMI session, the neck of my guitar cracked. A man who knew a man gave me his address. I knocked on his door at 11 at night." A pause. He answered in his work clothes, fixed it with wood glue, a bicycle clamp, and 3 hours of his own sleep. When I asked what I owed him, he said, "Come back and tell me what happens." He stopped. I never went back. I have thought about that for 40 years. 30 people had gathered without meaning to. A woman near the back was crying. She would spend years trying to explain this morning to people who had not been there, and never find the right words. Derek Harmon had not moved. His leather satchel was on the ground beside him. He did not remember putting it there. Then Paul reached into his jacket pocket. What he placed in Thomas's open hand was not money, not a card, not a signature. It was something that had lived in that pocket since September 1962, and it changed what this guitar was, and what Thomas was, in a way no price in the world could have reached. If what you feel right now has no name, that feeling is called witnessing something true. Hit like, because this story deserves to reach everyone who needs it. A guitar pick, old, edges worn smooth by years of use, the kind that has touched 10,000 strings and carries the memory of every one. Paul closed Thomas's fingers around it before Thomas could speak. "I have carried that since the night Arthur fixed my guitar," he said quietly. "I do not know what it is worth, but it belongs with this." Thomas looked at the pick in his palm. He tried to say something. The crowd had not gathered with any intention. They had simply slowed, one by one, the way people slow when they pass a lit window and see something inside that reminds them of their own life. Someone raised their phone and then lowered it, as if recording it would make it smaller than it was. Paul straightened his jacket. He took no photographs. A woman approached and he touched her hand gently and shook his head. "Not here." She nodded, as if she understood, because she did. Then Derek spoke. His voice was smaller. He was not looking at Paul. He was looking at Thomas, at the guitar, at the pick in Thomas's closed hand, and something in his face had come loose. "I did not know," he said. "I did not know what it was." Paul looked at him. No anger, no contempt. The look of someone who recognizes grief, wearing a practical disguise. "You had a chance to ask him," Paul said. Derek's jaw tightened. 14 months ago, his father had died in a Berkshire hospital on a Tuesday morning while Derek sat in traffic on the M4, 20 minutes away. He had walked these markets every weekend since, not for the business, for the clean transaction of price, because price never asked you anything, and price never looked like the face of someone who was gone. He had not looked at a single seller's face in 14 months. He looked at Thomas's face now. He picked up his satchel, nodded once, not an apology, but the nearest thing to one he had managed since his father died, and walked away without looking back. Paul watched him go. Then, "Your grandfather built things that lasted," he said. "That means everything, actually." Thomas looked at the price tag still on the tuning peg, worked it loose with one fingernail. 40 pounds, in his own handwriting, from this morning, which already felt like another year entirely. He tucked it inside the sound hole, beside the penciled words, "For Tom." He was not going to sell this guitar. He was going to do something harder and longer and more worthwhile, something Arthur had waited his whole life for someone in his family to do, and never once asked for out loud. If this story moved you, tell someone today. Leave a comment below and subscribe, because the next story is one you will not want to miss. The applause started with one pair of hands. Not a performance crowd, not a planned response, just one person who could no longer hold what they were feeling and let it out through their palms. Then another. Then the whole row. Warm, long. The kind of applause that arrives when something true has happened in a public place, and the people around it need each other to know they were there. Paul stood. He straightened his jacket. He looked at the 40 or so people gathered in the narrow market row and gave a small smile. Not the smile of someone used to crowds, but the quieter one, of a man genuinely surprised to find this many people standing still on a Saturday morning. He turned back to Thomas one last time. "He would have been proud of you today," Paul said, "for not letting it go." Thomas looked at him. "I nearly did." Paul nodded slowly. Nearly is the most important word in every story worth telling. Then he put his cap back on, turned up the collar of his jacket, and walked back into Portobello Road. Within 30 seconds, he was simply a man browsing on a Saturday morning, and the market closed around him the way water closes over a stone, and he was gone. Thomas stood at the empty table, guitar pressed to his chest, the pick in his palm, the folded price tag inside the sound hole next to the penciled words. For Tom. Around him, the market moved on. Lamps, clocks, silver, the ordinary weight of forgotten things. A normal Saturday in London, from every angle but one. He drove home with the guitar in the back seat, went straight to his mother's kitchen, set it on the table between them, and said 4 words he had not planned to say, 4 words that changed the direction of everything that came after. The 4 words were, "Teach me to build." His mother looked at him across the kitchen table. Then she went to the cupboard under the stairs and came back with a cardboard box. Arthur's tools. Every one, wrapped in cloth, the way you wrap things you intend someone to find. She had kept them since the funeral, waiting without knowing what she was waiting for. 18 months later, in the same 12-foot workshop, behind the same terraced house in Shepherd's Bush, the same sawdust, the same linseed oil, the smell Thomas had carried since childhood. He bent over his first guitar top and tapped the spruce with 2 fingers, the way Arthur had every morning, listening for the voice inside the wood. On the shelf above the workbench, Arthur's last guitar, built in 3 years of failing hands. For Tom, in soft pencil inside the sound hall. A worn guitar pick with smooth edges. A folded price tag that read £40 in Thomas's own handwriting. He tapped the spruce again. Not yet. Tomorrow, maybe. Arthur Webb never became famous. His name is in no music history. But he built something that lasted long enough to reach the right hands. And that is the only kind of legacy that cannot be taken from you. Not price, not auction value, not fame. Just this. What has someone you loved left behind that no price tag could ever touch? Tell me in the comments, and if this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who needs it today.